The purpose of the bill is to fulfil the programme for government commitment to hold a referendum on the abolition of the Seanad. It will be held in the autumn. The government also intends to hold a referendum on the establishment of a Court of Civil Appeal on the same day, and possibly other issues arising from the earlier reports of the Constitutional Convention. As the government is proposing this referendum, it is appropriate that I, as Taoiseach, should outline the reasons why we are doing so. In July 2009, at the McGill Summer School, announced that Fine Gael was embarking on a root and branch analysis of the political system. As part of that analysis, we looked in detail at the role of the Seanad and came to the clear conclusion that reforming it was not realistic or achievable. The key difficulty with all of the proposals for reform is that they take the existence of the Seanad, with its widely acknowledged flaws, as a given. It would either remain an unrepresentative elitist composition or a directly elected entity that would seek to duplicate the Dáil. Instead, the correct approach is to start by asking whether we need a second house at all. I do not believe that we do. For 75 years, political insiders have discussed and debated Seanad reform. 10 reports on reform of the second house have been published since it was established in 1938. Yet not a single one has been implemented. Many of whom ignored the Seanad and Dáil reform when in power have argued vigorously against the holding of a referendum. Yet it is the Constitution that declares that the people are sovereign. What could be more appropriate or more democratic than asking the people to decide on the future of the Seanad following 75 years of inaction by the political establishment? The proposed abolition of the Seanad is part of this government's comprehensive programme of political reform, a programme that will establish a new politics in our republic, one that is more accountable, more democratic and more responsive. It is time to create a new political system that will put people's faith and hope back into Irish politics. This government's proposals to modernise the political system, with major reform of the Dáil and abolition of the Seanad, the most radical reform of local government in 100 years, and the establishment of a constitutional convention to review the country's supreme law, represent the biggest package of political reform since the passing of the Constitution in 1937. We've cut the number of TDs and increased the number of Dáil sitting days. We've reduced the pay and allowances of all politicians. We've halved the cost of ministerial transport. We are radically reforming local government, which will reduce the number of local authorities from 114 to 31, and the number of councillors from 1,600 to 950. But the truth is that we still have too many politicians in Ireland. The abolition of the Seanad will enable this country, when combined with the reduction of 8 in the number of TDs, to cut the number of public representatives by almost 1/3. It has been estimated that abolition will save up to €20 million per annum over time on the running costs of the Oireachtas. I make no apology, Ceann Comhairle, for seeking to cut the cost of politics in Ireland. There is something fundamentally wrong, in my view, with politicians asking others to change, asking the citizens of this country to make real sacrifices, and not doing the same ourselves. The reason Ireland has significantly more politicians than other small countries is very simple. We have a second house. 5 European countries have approximately the same population as Ireland, between 4 to 6 million. These are Denmark, Finland, Norway, Croatia and Slovakia. None of them has a Senate. But no government should or would seek to abolish a House of Parliament simply to reduce the number of politicians. We are in favour of abolition because the Seanad has not worked. It is an outdated institution that owes more to 1930s vocationalist ideas than it does to modern constitutional thinking. The theory on which the Seanad is based is no longer relevant, and its elitist composition does not reflect modern Irish society. Parliamentary democracy has moved on around the world. Maintaining a House of Parliament in which 43 members are elected by a tiny electorate, 6 elected by an incomplete third-level electorate, and 11 nominated by the Taoiseach of the day is simply not defensible. The following critique of the Seanad summarises the case for its abolition very well in my view. And I quote, "Much of the rationale for the inclusion of the Seanad in Bunreacht and Éireann has ceased to be relevant over time. Serious questions must be asked about the continued role of an entity which is still struggling to justify its existence after three-quarters of a century. It is important to note that second chambers are not an essential part of parliamentary democracy. If these words sound familiar to members in the House, then they should. This damning critique of the Seanad was contained in the manifesto for the 2011 general election in Fianna Fáil's programme. Supporters of Seanad retention are deeply divided about what kind of reformed Seanad they want. Some want it to be an elected second Dáil, others a house of experts, yet others some form of citizens' assembly. It is precisely this lack of consensus which means that reform has never happened or will ever happen. The experience of Canada suggests that the no reform option is the most likely outcome. There have been over 20 major proposals for constitutional Senate reform in Canada since the early 70s, and all have failed. The contention that a second house is crucial to democracy is simply untrue. All of the Scandinavian countries have abolished their second houses. These countries have some of the most accountable and the most effective political systems in the world. Other small successful countries such as New Zealand have shown that it is perfectly possible to establish checks and balances within a single-chamber unicameral parliament. Most of the new nations in Central and Eastern Europe have also decided that they do not need a Senate. If a second house is so central to democracy, as some would maintain, why have so many of the emerging democracies decided to do without one? In a strong, long-established parliamentary democracy like ours, a second chamber is even less of a requirement. The correct approach is to start by asking whether we need a second house. The government believe that a second chamber is no more necessary here in Ireland than it is in other small unitary states. We believe that a reformed Dáil can give this country a fit-for-purpose parliament, one which fully meets the needs of a 21st century democracy. As I've said, we have started the process of real Dáil reform. Much more is obviously needed. The government believes that in tandem with the abolition of the Seanad, further change is required to strengthen the role of the Dáil. First, we will reform the way the Dáil deals with legislation. Legislation will first be submitted to the relevant Dáil committee in heads of bill format. This means that suggestions for change in legislation can be considered, and that any key flaws identified before the full legislation is even published. To allow for extra consideration and scrutiny of legislation in the Dáil itself, a new schedule will increase the time allocated for legislation. I expect 4-day sittings will become the weekly norm. Each bill will be referred back to the committee that originally considered it for a final examination. And furthermore, the Minister will have to revert back to the relevant Dáil committee within 12 months after the enactment of a bill to review and discuss its functioning and its effectiveness. This new legislative process will ensure, therefore, that legislation is fully considered before, during and after it is enacted. We will empower committees to carry out investigations and inquiries into matters of major public importance. The legislation to give this effect has been recently published. Furthermore, we also propose to radically overhaul the committee system itself in the Dáil. 14 Dáil committees will be established. Each committee will have 12 members and will be able to invite external experts to provide specialist input into their particular work. The government has been impressed by how the expert panel has contributed to the work of the Constitutional Convention, and will examine how a similar type of panel or panels could contribute to the work of Dáil committees. We also believe that the independence of committees should be strengthened. We will therefore introduce the D'Hondt system to distribute chairs of key committees on a proportional and equitable basis. If approved by the people, I and the government are convinced that we will create a better, more effective political system with greater accountability, better oversight and deeper scrutiny of legislation.